Hi, welcome to Right to Top. I'm Adam. In today's video, I'm going to go over a few ways to show contrast in your writing. And we're going to discuss what does it mean to contrast and what does it mean to compare. And there are many words we can use to do this, but because there are so many, I decided to split it into two videos. And today in part one, we're going to look only at the conjunctions that we can use to show contrast. The phrases and prepositions, we're going to look in part two, but I'll give you a list at the end of this video of what phrases and terms we're going to look at in the next video. So let's start with part one, conjunctions. So we're going to look at whereas, while, although, even though, but, and yet. These are the conjunctions that we're going to use to show a contrast. Now, before we get into how these work and how to use them, let's look at we have to be very clear to make sure we understand what it is to contrast and what it is to compare. Because you can do both or you can do one or the other, okay? A comparison. Now, a lot of people think that when you're asked to compare things, you're asked to look for the similarities. But a comparison asks you to look for similarities and differences. Now, for those of you who are going to be taking the IELTS or TOEFL, some questions are going to say compare the advantages of something. Some are going to say compare the advantage or compare and contrast these two views, okay? If they only ask you to compare and that's all they say, then yeah, just look at the similarities, look at how two things are similar. But if they ask you to compare and then say which you think is better, then automatically, necessarily, you must also show the differences between these two things. And that's where you're going to use these contrasting words and expressions, okay? On the other hand, to contrast just means to show the actual opposition or differences. So comparison is showing the differences and similarities between two things. Contrasting implies a change. Something changed or something is different or something is other than the thing. Now, keep in mind, you can contrast two separate things, show their differences, show how they work in opposition, or you can contrast different aspects of one thing. Okay, so one thing, it has good things and bad things to it. So you can do both. Now, when I talk about changes, differences, etc., you can talk about negation. Something is, but something isn't. Okay, it is this, but it isn't that. You can talk about direction. Sales went up, but revenues went down. Degree. It was very hot, but not too hot, okay? So you can talk about all these different things and result, view, condition, and status. The reason I underlined expectation, when you're contrasting expectations, generally this is what is expected to happen and versus what actually happened. Now, expectations are the most subtle, I guess you could say. Like, they're hardest ones to realize there's a contrast there between expectation and actuality. So you have to be very careful with that one. And it also makes a difference in which term or which conjunction you're going to use. Now, I noted here in the bottom, a contrast is not necessarily a contradiction. Sometimes a contrast is just a difference. It doesn't have to oppose. Like, you don't have to oppose the two things or the two sides of one thing. Sometimes they could just be two different things and they don't work well together or just different, okay? So let's get into the use of the conjunctions, okay? We're going to start with whereas and while. And I know people have a hard time with this word whereas. You shouldn't, really. Once you understand when to use it, it's actually quite easy to use, okay? Whereas and while are both adverb clause conjunctions, meaning you have to have a full clause with these words. Sometimes you can use a participle. I'll show you with while. You can do that. That's one of the differences. But generally, when you're using whereas or while to compare two separate things, okay, to show the differences between two things, they are interchangeable. You can use whereas or while in the same way. So comparing two things, ideas, actions, facts, etc., in terms of differences. So let's look at an example. We're going to compare economic theories. So the general discussion of your essay is economic theories or economic policies, approaches, etc. And you're going to look at two different theories of economics, okay? Capitalism, socialism. Whereas capitalism favors a free market, socialism advocates more government intervention. So these things are not fighting each other, they're just different. One goes this way, one goes that way, okay? Capitalism 1, socialism 2, under the umbrella of economic theories. Also notice I can use whereas or while when I'm comparing two different things and just showing the differences. Also notice capitalism favors a free market while socialism advocates more government intervention. I can put these conjunctions with either clause because the two clauses themselves are pretty much equal. Both are giving straightforward information or fact. So the conjunction can go with either one. It doesn't make any difference. You want to put it in the beginning of the sentence, you want to put it in the middle of the sentence, fine. You want to put it with the first clause, you want to put it with the second clause, also fine. It doesn't change the meaning, doesn't change the emphasis. You're not actually emphasizing anything with these two conjunctions, okay? Let's move on, look at how they are actually different from each other. So one of the main differences with whereas and while. Capitalism favors a free market while making allowances for limited assistance to those unable to compete. So, whereas can only be used when you're comparing two different things, capitalism, socialism. While can be used to show a contrast between two aspects of one thing. So it's very similar to though or although in this case. Although and though, as we'll see in a moment, you're only looking at contrasting elements of one thing, whereas two separate things. While could be used for two separate things or two aspects of one thing. Another difference, notice that after while, I'm using making, I'm using a participle. Capitalism favors a free market while it makes allowances for limited assistance to those unable to compete. So we're talking about capitalism in both clauses. The subject of the second one is it, which is capitalism. And I'm using a participle. I can't use a participle with whereas. After whereas, you must have a full clause with subject and verb, okay? And I can, with while, I can also put it at the beginning. While making allowances for limited assistance to those unable to compete, capitalism favors a free market. I can change the order around. While capitalism favors a free market, it makes allowances for, and then I can't use the participle because it's not with the conjunction, okay? So that's the main difference between while and whereas. But there's one other thing I want you to always keep in mind. The students understood the professor clearly while he was demonstrating the process, but in the lab, they all seemed confused. So notice here I have while and but. Am I using two contrasting conjunctions? No, I'm not. While is also a time conjunction. So don't get confused between the contrast function and the time function. Although even though when I'm using it as a contrast function, it still has the element of time in it, just like yet does, which we're going to look at after. But it's still, when I'm using it as a time conjunction, it's a time conjunction. When I'm using it as a contrast conjunction, it's a contrast conjunction, adverb conjunction. Okay? So that's whereas and while. Let's move on to although and even though. Okay, although and even though. People very often mix these up. In some cases, they're interchangeable, but in most cases, you cannot use one or the other, and the other. You have to use one or the other, excuse me. So, although, even though, what are we showing? First of all, these are both contrast tools, directly contrasting two different elements of a single thing or situation or action, etc. So you have one thing. So for example, sales went up, although revenues went down. So we're talking about sales and two different aspects of sales, okay? One thing being compared, two aspects, not two different things. So although, let's go back to the original example I used before. Although capitalism favors a free market, socialism advocates more government intervention. Is this a good sentence? No. Why? Because capitalism and socialism are two different things. They're two separate economic theories. So here I can't use although. Here I would have to use whereas or while. Although, one thing. Whereas while, two things. So we'll strike this sentence out. So capitalism favors a free market, although it does recognize that some members of society might be disadvantaged in a competitive environment and may need some assistance. So what is contrast? What is the actual contrast here? capitalism favors a free market, means that governments shouldn't really have any involvement in how the market works. Although, so here I'm showing the contrast, the opposite view, giving some or people, the disadvantaged people, some assistance. So this goes against the idea of a free market. So I'm showing the contrast, and I'm saying it, capitalism, same thing, does recognize. I'm emphasizing the does to show that this is the thing, this is the contrast. And I'm emphasizing does recognize to show that it is a contrast and that there is a little bit of leeway with capitalism. I could say, although it recognizes that. I just want to emphasize that recognition with does recognize. Okay, so there's a contrast. And again, with although, and you have a contrast, I can put it with either clause. I can put it at the beginning, I can put it in the middle. Although capitalism favors a free market, it does recognize. So when the two clauses are equally saying something, the although can go with either clause and the meaning doesn't change, the emphasis doesn't necessarily change. But even though, now even though can sometimes just be a very strong emphasized contrast. Or it could be a concession. It can concede that something else is understood and accepted, but, and the next point. Now, with even though, you can't change the location. You can't change which clause it goes with without changing the meaning of the sentence, okay? So it must go with the point of contrast, the point that you want to emphasize, okay? Even stresses the clause that sets up and stresses the expectation. Let's look at examples to understand. Even though the mayor lied to his constituents, the people living in the town who vote for the mayor, they re-elected him for another term. Now, I could say, although the mayor lied to his constituents, they re-elected him for another term. Even though is just a stronger although. But if I say, the mayor lied to his constituents, even though they re-elected him for another term, this is a different meaning of a sentence. So let's look at the first one. Even though he lied to them, they know he lied, they understand that he did lie to them, they voted for him anyway. So there's that idea of anyway. So you think the expectation is he lied to them, they won't vote for him. No, they did vote for him, and that's why you're emphasizing the first clause that he lied to them. So you're setting up that expectation. You're stressing this is the expectation that they won't vote, but they did. Okay? Now, if I say the mayor lied to his constituents, even though they re-elected him, means first they re-elected him. So the expectation is he should be nice to them. But no, he lied to them anyway. So there's still the idea of anyway, but I'm focusing on the second part. There's a bit of a sense of chronology, which action happened first. So if I put even though with lied, he lied first, they re-elected second. If I say even though with re-elected, they re-elected first, he lied second. So there's also an idea of chronology, of time order. Now, let's look at a couple more examples. Even though the test results proved negative, the doctors prescribed an intensive diet regimen for Jim. So he took a test for cholesterol, let's say, and the test proved negative. It means no problem with his cholesterol. They gave him a diet anyway. So you think, even though the expectation is that they understand he has no problem, they gave him the diet anyway. The test results proved negative, even though the doctors prescribed him the diet. So they made him go on a diet to whatever situation he had to lose weight or obesity, whatever. Then he took the test and it proved negative, means he didn't improve. So again, the order where you put the even though changes the actual meaning, and it also changes which part you actually want to stress, which is the expectation, which is the result. I hope that's a little bit clearer there. Okay, let's look at but and yet. So these are coordinating conjunctions. So these are different. These are not adverb clause conjunctions. So whereas, while, although, even though are all part of an adverb clause, a dependent clause, okay? They show contrast. But and yet must have two independent clauses that they're joining together. So the two independent clauses are equal. There isn't one subordinate to the other. They're both equal. Both can be sentences on their own. However, there are situations where you can use but or although, and I'll show you those in a minute. So two independent clauses, and again, you're showing the different aspects of one thing. Okay, you can show the differences. Now, keep in mind, if I say Bill likes pizza, but Kelly likes hamburgers, you're not comparing Kelly and you're not comparing necessarily Kelly and the other guy. You're comparing the two things they like, their likes. So it's still one thing, different aspects of those things. You can also say one likes pizza whereas the other likes hamburgers. Then you're doing a comparison. If you're talking about going to eat, one likes this, one likes that, the likes are different, there's a problem where to eat. Yet has the idea of time in it, but at the same time. So similar to while. While also has the idea of time in it, but is just a straightforward contrast, things that are working against each other or just very differently, like although. So I'm sticking to the same examples. Capitalism favors a free market, yet means at the same time, but at the same time, it recognizes the fact that some members of society need help. Okay? So it understands this is the way capitalism works. At the same time, it does show something that's a little bit in contrast in terms of assistance. Capitalism favors a free market, but it also recognizes. Now, why did I add also? With yet, I didn't need the also because the also is kind of part of the yet at the same time, means also. But here I put but it also. Why? Because I'm adding actually 2 points. I'm giving you two aspects of capitalism, 1 plus 2. But 2 is in contrast to 1. So I want to add the also. On the other hand, capitalism favors a free market, but it doesn't want to do other things for whatever the other thing is. Here I have a direct favors, positive verb. It doesn't, whatever negative verb. So there's a direct contrast, and that's why I don't need the also. It's just a but by itself, direct contrast. Now, let's look at a few other examples where you can mix all these things up. The mayor has been known to lie to his constituents, but they still voted for him for a lack of better alternative. Yet they still voted. What's the difference here? First, notice after constituents, I put a semicolon. I can basically split the two ideas. I could put a semicolon, and then I can use but or yet, and then the comma after the but or after the yet, not before. I could also put constituents, comma, but they still voted for him. The reason I would split it is because I want to emphasize each point separately. So I would sort of like, it's almost like two separate sentences, but I join them with a semicolon. Sorry. Okay. Now, if you see my semicolon lesson, punctuation lesson, if I was using and, I wouldn't, if I was using semicolon with and, I would take out the and. With but, I need to leave it because a contrast needs to stay. Okay? Here's a different example. Scientists are adamant, their very strong belief, that climate change is a very serious problem, yet, but although they concede that they do not have viable solutions to tackle it at this time. So remember what I said before, that although you can put with either clause. If that's the case, then you can alternate it with but. You can put yet, but, although. The only difference is I can put although at the beginning of the sentence. I can't put but at the beginning of the sentence when I have two equal independent clauses. That's the main difference. So sometimes you see two clauses and one of them becomes dependent with although. You could make it both independent with but. The meaning doesn't change. You can use either one. Just be careful about positioning, okay? Although scientists concede that they do not have viable solutions to tackle climate change at this time, they are adamant that it is a serious problem. I can also change the order. I can change the order and put but in the middle, or I can change the order, put although in the middle or the beginning, not with but. Now, another thing, I want to focus on this although versus but. So they can be interchanged if both clauses are equal. The candidate has the qualification, although he lacks interpersonal skills. So basically think, can I put a period between the two clauses and have two separate sentences? The candidate has the qualification. He lacks interpersonal skills. So I have two equal strength or equal value independent clauses. I can join them with although or but. Again, although the candidate has the qualifications, he lacks interpersonal skills. I can put although at the beginning. I can't put but at the beginning. The candidate lacks interpersonal skills, although he does have the qualification. I can change the order of the information and keep the two in the same place because they're equal, right? And again, he does have the qualification. I want to emphasize that part. Although the candidate lacks, I can put although at the beginning, I can't put but. Both can be reduced in a parallel structure. The candidate has the qualification, though not the experience, but not the experience. But he does not have the experience, though he does not have the experience. Because I have the same subject and verb, I can reduce, I can take them out with though and but. Notice I don't use although. If I'm going to use a parallel reduction, I'm going to use though, not although. Now, you may have had a lot of teachers telling you that never begin a sentence with but or and or, like with a coordinating conjunction. It's totally okay. Grammatically, it's fine. Technically, it's fine. I do not recommend it for the IELTS or TOEFL or any of these language tests. They don't like it. The graders don't like it. But 100% for sure, never begin a paragraph with and or but or. You can begin a sentence, but again, it has a slightly different meaning. Okay, so let me give you an example. The candidate has the qualifications, and we definitely recommend him for the position, period. But he does lack experience, so we suggest teaming him up with a mentor. Here you notice I'm starting the sentence with but the whole but is for the whole entire clause. Here's the result of this contrast, but there's also a solution, basically a proposition for a solution. So we suggest doing something with him. So you can do it that way, but again, if you're not 100% sure, just avoid it and stick to the irregular conjunctions as well. One other thing, common errors, and I see these on sample essays all the time. Even though the students worked hard, but they failed the test. So what's the problem here? Even though, but, you have two contrasting conjunctions, you can't, one only. And I see this a lot, so it's not like it's, oh, who would make this mistake? A lot of people make this mistake. Make sure you don't do that. Although the professor spent extra time drilling his idea into his students' heads with countless exercises to make sure they were prepared. What's wrong with this sentence? Well, actually, it's not a sentence. That's what's wrong. This is a sentence fragment. You're beginning with an adverb clause conjunction. So the whole thing is technically an adverb clause. You don't have an independent clause anywhere here. So this is called a sentence fragment, and you would lose points for that. Those who do their homework regularly tend to perform better on tests and other evaluations. Yet this does not guarantee a better fundamental understanding of the core subjects. In this case, what you should do after evaluations, semicolon, small y, yet, comma, this does not guarantee, because there's a very direct relationship between the two ideas you're presenting here. So make sure you put a semicolon before yet, okay? Now, another last thing I want to mention, it's very important that when you're showing a contrast, and it is an actual opposite because you can't show opposites, contradictions, make sure that they are logical, okay? So here's an example. I love Jane, but I also hate her. Now, in terms of grammar, this doesn't make sense. But in terms of human beings, yeah, it makes complete sense. You can love and hate somebody. So that's okay. Sales went up, but we didn't move any more product than usual. Well, this doesn't actually make sense. If you didn't move any more product, how did sales go up? So there's no logic here. The contrast is too obvious. Something is missing here. The sales had to come from somewhere. So you have to give more information or take out the but and try to make sense out of this sentence. Okay. Now, that's basically it. I hope that was all good and clear. In part 2, I will look at phrases like on the other hand, in opposition, linking terms nevertheless, however, and prepositions unlike, despite, etc. So come back to watch that video as well. If you have any questions, of course, ask me here below in YouTube. I'll be happy to help you out. I hope you like this video. I hope it helps you with your writing to show contrast. If you like the video, please give me a like and please subscribe to my channel if you like it. More videos coming about writing, grammar, test tips, all this good stuff for you to improve your chances with the tests. So, I'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.